This is the CRE Weekly Digest by Lightbox, a firm transforming the commercial real estate landscape by connecting every step of the CRE process with comprehensive tools and data. I'm Melissa Lewis with our experts Manus, Clancy, and Dianne Crocker. Today, we're very fortunate to have as our guest Gregg Katz, Director of Business Industry Solutions for Real Estate at Esri. Gregg provides thought leadership and subject matter expertise focused on driving awareness, education, and innovation across commercial and corporate real estate, as well as retail and consumer trends. Previously, Gregg held leadership roles at Retail Stat and TSCG, the shopping center group, where he was part of innovative teams developing strategies around real estate and retail data, location analytics, industry and consumer trends, and geospatial solutions. Gregg, welcome, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Gregg, before we jump in, I want to recommend that our listeners connect with you on LinkedIn. You will not be disappointed, whether it's intel on retail trends or that story about the drunk raccoon who passed out in the liquor store or GameStop's brilliant Christmas strategy that let people literally come in and return any junk they wanted in exchange for GameStop credit. I remember a taxidermy bobcat. Gregg is on top of all these stories. And so, Gregg, we're really, really excited to have you and welcome.
Thank you. This should be a lot of fun.
It's been a really long time since we've done a deep dive into retail, so I'm excited to spend the next 30 or 40 minutes talking about it. But before we get into the weeds, Gregg, we like to ask our guests, how did you find yourself here? One day you're a 12-year-old riding your bike, and then a decade or two later, you're in the commercial real estate world. Tell us about the journey and how did you get here?
So the short version is I actually grew up as a retail kid and running the retail aisles. My family in Atlanta, Georgia, started a jewelry and gift store back in the day in downtown Atlanta, and that evolved into what was known as catalog showrooms. We created this catalog showroom business that grew to about 8 or 9 stores, and it made its way through Atlanta and into South Carolina and finally into North Carolina. And about 18 years old, getting ready to go to college, and they decided to sell out to service merchandise. And so that kind of changed my course a little bit because I'm like, now what? I had just assumed, the whole family was in the business, uncles, aunts, nieces, nephews, grandparents, et cetera. And so I had to pivot a little bit, and that actually took me into the restaurant business for a while. And it led to me owning and operating restaurants in the Orlando, Florida area for several years. But as crazy and as fun both as that was, the most enjoyment for me was in the site selection and trying to optimize the locations throughout Orlando. And so when I ended up selling that business out, I transitioned over to the shopping center group and just started leveraging the expertise that I had in retail and real estate and started in the brokerage world. So it's been an interesting journey, but one that started very, very young.
So really, really in the blood. Love that. We don't hear that too often. Most of the times it's people stumbling upon it and finding their way sometime in their 20s. But for you, it was really a lifelong experience. That's great to hear. Let me throw it over to you, Dianne.
Yeah, of course. So you found your calling early, Gregg, and you're doing well with it. So we're glad to have you here. There's a lot that we want to get your thoughts on, but I want to start by kind of challenging you to look back at the few years in retail because it's been going through this new stage of evolution. A few years ago, everybody was talking about the retail apocalypse and how e-commerce was going to hit brick and mortar stores hard. And then, of course, COVID happened. So I'm kind of curious to hear your take on what retail's been going through these past few years.
It's interesting, right? I think that the retail apocalypse discussion was overly simplistic. I think it just simply was looking at openings and versus closings or vice versa, whichever way you want to look at it, and not looking at the bigger picture. We had a lot of closures, yes, and we had a lot of shakeups, and you could definitely argue, justifiably so, that we were over-retailed in the U.S. But I think a lot of it was dealing with legacy retail and the legacy retail that wasn't evolving and changing over time. And so I think those legacy retailers were a big bulk of the closures and a big bulk of the problems, but there was still a lot of retail thriving and a lot of innovative concepts coming into play. It was just being overshadowed because the story wasn't as good from a media perspective. So I think COVID was interesting because COVID created a right sizing and allowed all of these retailers to step back and say, now what? And now let's look at our e-commerce strategy, since that appeared to be, at the time, knocking out brick and mortar, right? Everybody said, oh, e-commerce, look at the acceleration and look at what's happening. But in reality, I think it was just allowing everybody to kind of reposition themselves and understand and try to be prepared for what was going to change coming out of COVID for the, from a consumer perspective and from shopping trend perspective. It was interesting because I think it showed the need for quality, and it showed the importance of blending the art and science from a retail perspective and from a real estate perspective, and making sure you're making the right decisions and that you understand. I don't like the word omni-channel. I think it's kind of overhyped, but that you understand that unified commerce strategy that needs to take place, and that they both, brick and mortar and e-commerce, have their place in the retail world. And so I think it allowed for all of this to start reshaping itself and create a new future that has been both interesting and I think evolving from a retail perspective.
I like the word you use, Gregg, simplistic, in that over the last 10 years or so, it seemed like 90% of the headlines surrounded the department store operators, the Sears, the Macy's, the JCPenney's, and the failing B and C class malls. But only about 10% of retail kind of falls into that category. And I think people got caught up in the negativity and missed some opportunities. What do you think about that?
I agree. I think it's a good point. It's interesting. You look at Sears and Macy's and, all of these concepts, and even, to a certain degree, the Nordstroms and now obviously Saks Fifth Avenues of the world. I think you get caught up in what was, to your point, kind of versus what is, and how do you evolve? And a lot of these concepts just stayed stagnant and said, people will come, we'll figure it out, don't worry. Or, maybe we change our product mix a little bit. And they just weren't looking at the picture holistically. And I think malls were going through an evolution as well. And so to your point, you've got these big anchors and these big name concepts that have been around for, 20, 30, 50, 100 years. And all of a sudden, now you see they're struggling, and it becomes what to do. But all of these other concepts out there were watching, learning, listening to the trends in the consumers and really evolving. And even the ones that tried and failed, I think taught the other retailers a lot of what we should and shouldn't do. And it really evoked some brilliant retail decisions, especially among some of these brands that are more nimble and can make those decisions and evolve with the times.
So what I'm wondering, Gregg, is when Gregg Katz walks into a mall, what are you looking at? What are you paying attention to? What jumps out at you?
So the first thing, in all honesty, and maybe it's just because of the data nerd in me, I guess you could call it, I think the first thing I start looking at is the people in a mall. That's opportunity, right? That's not necessarily transactions. And I think we've seen too many people equate, things like visitation with transactions. And yes, in a restaurant, if you're inside the restaurant, most likely you're transacting. But in something like a mall, the first thing I start to look at is, are there shopping bags? Are people actually buying? And what stores are they going in? And what stores are they coming out of with something? And again, it's a little harder to tell these days because a lot of times you can go in and you can order something online or do something like that. But just to get a sense of, are they transacting or are they window shopping or, kind of wishful shopping, so to speak, right? Where they're, just kind of strolling and the what ifs out there from a shopping perspective. Then I start looking at the patterns of these shoppers. Are they leaving one store and going to another from a cross-shopping perspective? And, what tenants seem to be thriving? What areas of the mall seem to be thriving? And more recently, I've started to look at this evolution in the malls of, we're putting in more mixed-use components. We're putting in apartment. We're putting in what people are now calling experiential retail, right? We're putting in these different things. And are they working and are they getting traffic? Or are people just passing by or passing through to get somewhere else? And so it's a lot of people watching and a lot of concept watching. My kids and my wife get a little angry at me because they've got a path they want to go on, and I keep stop, let's look over here. But it's a lot of fun because you can learn an awful lot boots on the ground inside a mall.
Yeah, it's changed a lot too. I mean, there's a mall near us that just went through a redevelopment and it's actually carpeted through and through. And there's definitely an emphasis on seating areas and just ways to get people to stay and events. I guess the concept is the longer they stay, the more likely they are to wander into a store and buy something and carry the bag that you're talking about.
And you can look at those demographics too while you're there, right? And you can start seeing, is it older? Is it younger? Does it appear? And again, it can be deceiving, but is it more affluent? Is it less affluent? And male, female. And you start looking and just seeing what are people doing? And I've always believed nothing beats boots on the ground in real estate. And I think from that perspective, what you can get out of a visit to any shopping center anywhere is far and beyond anything else you can get from just, pure data or Google Maps or whatever the case is.
It's a funny path we've traveled. If you remember, Greg, years ago, they'd have the rubber hoses in the parking lots to figure out how many cars were going in and out of it. And then we went to aerial imagery. How many cars are in the parking lot today? And now we have things like Placer AI and credit card receipts that we're tracking, things like that to give us a better sense. But you're still saying boots on the ground beats everything else, and you're a constant visitor to malls. Give us one or two things that maybe you're seeing from being in person in these malls that maybe somebody that's just looking at electronic data and phone services might be missing in terms of trends.
There's two things I see, and one of them goes back to what I said earlier, which is I don't think visitation always turns into transaction. And I think people mistake that. And I think some of the new data that we've seen out there, I'd love to hear people talk, oh, well, my center's ranked number one in visitation. Great. That's wonderful. Are you making any money, right? And are people transacting? To Diane's point, are people coming and staying and interacting with all of the different retail? But I think there's that. And the other thing I think is watching the difference generationally to a large respect of how the younger generations have started taking to shopping centers and especially malls and mixed use, et cetera, and how they're using it for that. Let's go, let's socialize, let's get that experience, but let's also, I'd rather transact that way. I'd rather do this in person in a lot of cases than online. So I think that gets overlooked a lot. And I think it's very interesting to watch the dynamics that exist and how that younger generation tends to pull a lot of the other generations with them as they're running around. But to me, the malls have gotten a lot younger, and that's good to see because I think it shows the evolution of retail, right? And the fact that there's staying power in this and it's evolving and continuing to attract a user base.
Wow, I didn't see that coming. That's a great answer. I didn't see malls getting younger was certainly not on my bingo card. How about you, Dianne?
Well, as the parent of two teens, I can attest to the fact that they like to just go and hang out there, and they're not necessarily spending, but they want to see and be seen. They want to shop, and they might come home and buy their clothes online, but they like to go there and just look in the storefront. So I don't think that's going away. They maybe don't have the big hair and shoulder pads that I had in the 80s when I went to the mall.
Well, but it's the touch and feel component, right? And I will say that retailers are, I've noticed the forward-thinking retailers are looking at transacting as kind of a global thing. And so there's a lot of innovative retailers that are saying, we don't care where you transact as long as you transact, right? And they're even incenting their stores to look at the market, not just the store from a performance perspective. So they're saying, if they can come in a store, they can touch, they can feel, they can leave, like you just mentioned, and buy, fine, but they're still buying, right? And so we want to look at everybody in this specific market area and look at performance from that perspective versus looking at the specific store since they're all interrelated. So I think the innovative ones are realizing as long as they transact, we're good, right? And we're going to give them every opportunity to transact where they want to transact.
Mm-hmm. You write an engaging series that I'm addicted to called The Corner of Main and Main. And I just love it because I do see the names from the malls of my childhood, like Tom McCann Shoes, Blockbuster. You even mentioned Ground Round Steakhouse, which I haven't heard in years. And this year we're seeing a wave of store closures. Everybody's got a Joann's or a Party City in their town that's now vacant. And you hit on an interesting point because I wanted to ask you what types of retailers that you see really making smart decisions. And if you're an investor, which retailers would they like to see, that would strike them as the ones with staying power? And what I'm hearing from you is it's the ones who are agile enough to kind of meet the customer where they are, whether it's buying in a mall or whether it's buying online. Did I hear you correctly there?
You did. I think there's a couple of exceptions, but 100%, I think that sums it up. I am a huge fan, as an example, of what Dick's Sporting Goods has done. I think they have really effectively blended the in-store, the online, and everything in between. And then they've also created the interrelation and the relationship with the customers. And they've done it through, I hate experiential because I think that doesn't define. I kind of use enjoyment retail because I think it's a little different. But I think they've mastered that with some of their new concepts and what they're doing in the store and allowing you to really enjoy the experience and start to dabble in different things and play around with different things. And I think the retailers that understand that, I mean, look, Apple mastered that years and years ago, right? And made it, fun to come in and you learn and you can touch and feel and play. And I think there's retailers out there that have understood that and are capturing the entire process of the customer and creating brand loyalty through that. So I love those two. I love Costco because to me, Costco is the best in enjoyment retail. You go in and you get to sample all this different food and stuff. And they're a master of putting all the stuff in the center that starts to attract you into the aisles. And, before you know it, an hour's gone by, your cart's full. And, you could be a family of two and you're still buying the 10-pound thing of Cheerios, right? And so it's just something about those concepts that really lure you in. And I'm a real big fan of those because I think they have staying power and they'll be around for a long time.
So I have to throw this detour in very quickly because of the way Dianne just teed up the last question. You talked about Tom McCann's and Ground Round. Do you have a most nostalgic brand that you miss, a favorite childhood store where you think, wow, when I was 8, I just loved going to this place? Is there something that doesn't exist anymore that fits that bill?
So for me, and yes, it's a little biased because of my background, but for me, service merchandise was all that and then some. I looked at the big catalog that you used to get, and that was the e-commerce version of things, right, at the time. And I just remember scrolling through the catalog and like folding down pages. Ooh, I love this. I want this. And, and going through and just getting immersed in that. But also when you went into the store, I just have these fond memories of the conveyor belts coming where the merchandise you ordered came down the conveyor belts and you were just waiting in anticipation. Like, is that mine? Is that my order? And it just created this retail experience that you don't really find that much today, right? Where it's somewhat immersive in some interesting ways. And so that just stuck with me the entire time, and how it taught a lot of retail lessons to a lot of retailers. And they did a lot of first out there that people still copy today. So that's the one that's near and dear to my heart.
I love that. That's fun. Sears catalog for me. Wouldn't be Christmas without the Sears catalog of my childhood.
Absolutely.
I did the same thing, folding down the pages. I do want to pick your brain a little bit on the topic of population migration. We're a society on the move, especially post-COVID. So population migration trends, I think, play a stronger role in underwriting than they ever did before. Partly, the shift to remote work kind of triggered that. I think post-COVID, some people thought, what, I'm going to move from New York City down to Nashville. We always wanted to do that. And I wonder, do you have an opinion on where investors might be getting population migration wrong today? And then secondly, what kind of geographic hotspots are you watching?
I think where people are getting migration wrong from looking at it holistically is, I think we used to do a lot of build it and they will come. And, so you would see the grocery store out in the middle of nowhere. And, theoretically, and with a lot of research, they had determined that this area was going to grow into itself in, 2 to 5 years, whatever the case was. And so I think you found a lot of developers just here's where the grocery's going, so I'm going to circle around it, right? Buy up all the land, and that's going to be where the next big thing is. And sometimes that would happen and sometimes it wouldn't. I think the important thing now is, there was this migration to the suburbs, I think, that definitely happened around COVID and post-COVID, right? Where everybody's like, I got to get out of the cities and I just want a little bit more family and more community based. And so I think the community based retail started to thrive. But then I think it shifted back a little bit and people started missing what they had and started coming back in. But I think these patterns, you can look and see that they're almost faddish in some of their movements. And so by that, I mean, at first it was like everybody's moving to the suburbs. Well, not everybody's. It was happening, but it wasn't happening as much as people were making it out to be. And same with coming back in. I think people want community, people want place and placemaking. And so I think it's no longer build it and they will come. It's understanding what's happening and what the trends look like and trying to get ahead of them. And yes, that's a little bit of build it and they will come, but it's not as speculative. And so I think look at the areas where things are starting to thrive and the trends are starting to happen. Look at Oregon. I think people are moving away from Florida a little bit and they're moving back up into, we're seeing a lot here in Georgia and in the Carolinas. And I think you're seeing these shifts. And so you've got to understand the why behind them. And I think that's where people miss. They see the what, but they don't see the why. And so they jump on a decision without understanding, is it long-term? Is it short-term? Is it a blip and a fad, or, is there more reality to it? So that's kind of what I look at and where I see some different shifts happening.
That reminds me, Gregg, of that old quote. And Manus, you're a hockey player, I think, so you can probably say this better than I can, but just the whole concept of not looking at where the puck is, but kind of anticipating where it will be. Was that Wayne Gretzky?
Wayne Gretzky, yeah.
All right. Not good with sports analogies. But let's segue to from population trends. You hit a little bit earlier when we were talking about malls, about demographics, and certainly to a retailer, the spending power, the buying power, and where that's concentrated is also a key consideration. So I wonder what you're seeing, is it Gen X? Is it Gen Z? What's going on with millennials? And what are you seeing from your perspective there?
So I think there's three key things. One is life events are happening later. So marriage, kids, buying your first home, all these milestones are happening later in life. And so I think that has changed some of what you would see from a typical generational patterns and some of the stereotypes, types, or the characteristics that are out there. That being said, retailers love to focus on lifetime value. And I get it. And it makes perfect sense. So you look at a Gen Alpha, you look at, Gen Z, millennials, the lifetime value is there. So let's focus on them. Let's get them hooked to the brand so that they, stay with us for years and years. But the real spending power sits with Gen X and to some degree the boomers. And so the older generations have the spending power right now. And it's interesting because I think a lot of retailers tend to overlook that. You're seeing a wave of what people call medtail and healthcare retail that I think is starting to pick up on that trend. But it's everything. It's everything from how housing is kind of looking and forecasting out, how people are going to work longer and stay in the workplace, and how the office environment looks. And from a retail perspective, I think it's easy to go for the low hanging fruit. But in this case, you've got Gen X that is kind of supporting two other generations. They've got older parents that have needs, and in a lot of cases, they're helping on that side. And they've got kids who never seem to leave the house, no matter what. And I've got two that are testaments to that, and I finally just got them out for good. But as that happens, I think, that influence that Gen X has is overlooked. It's a smaller generation, and it really is that tweener that gets overlooked, and that there's real opportunity there to grab a hold of. And the retailers that do that, I think we'll still have a long road to capitalize on that.
I have a related question on this. I really have no gut feel for this at all, and I'm hoping that you do. And that is, when we were growing up, maybe 25% of the country was watching Cheers. And if you hit that audience over and over and over again with a Pepsi commercial every week, that brand loyalty could be built. Now we're talking TikTok, Instagram, really short attention spans, a really diverse audience base, right? You never see this 25% rating for anything anymore. Can retailers really make that brand loyalty now? And are some doing better than others in reaching these audiences?
It's a great question and a great observation, because I think you're 100% right in terms of the attention spans and how the social selling has changed the dynamic. And you look at things like, I mean, the example I always use is the Stanley Cups, right? And how that literally showed up on the scene out of nowhere, became this monster thing very quickly, and then kind of faded away. And so I think there's a couple of things. If you're a retailer, how do you prepare for that, right? Something comes out of the blue, and by the time you go to get whatever product or products that you can get that kind of go with that fad, it's almost gone and it's out of favor and you're on to the next thing. So how you manage that from a brand and inventory perspective, from a retailer, I think it becomes much more about what you stand for and what you provide the consumer. And I've noticed that boomers tend to trust a brand and have trusted the brands over years and years and years. And that trust is the most important thing to them. And if the brand doesn't let them down, they will continue. I think the younger generations are looking at trust from a different perspective. And it is that I want to believe that you're doing everything the right way for the right causes. And the loyalty comes more from kind of the non-productized things and what they stand for as much as what they offer. And I think that creates the loyalty for those generations.
That's interesting. And it's really cool to kind of think about retail behavior being a reflection of where we are as a society, where our young people are. And then it challenges retailers to kind of think about who they want to market to and what messaging will work for them. I love that. I do want to go back for a minute, Gregg, to something that you said earlier when you mentioned nothing being better than boots on the ground. You know, there's so much talk today about this proliferation of data, certainly about AI. I wonder, like, as the tools get more powerful at harnessing this mountain of data that's out there on properties, how do you think that great site selection and effective site selection kind of strikes the right balance between that data and just exercising good old-fashioned human judgment?
This has been, for the last couple of years, been a very hot topic of mine in terms of how I feel and think about it. AI, to me, is an enhancer. It makes you more efficient and can take some of the processing speed and monotonous and repetitive tasks and help you get there quicker, right? I truly believe it will be and continue to be a game changer in that regard. But AI doesn't have relationships with landlords and retailers to tell you different strategies or to know a site's going to become available or space is going to become available because this tenant's suffering and it's the perfect space for one of your clients. And it doesn't see a trade area shift as it's starting to happen. It only kind of sees it after. And yes, it can predict, but predict is only as good as the information you feed it. And so to me, as you look at this, yes, do we need this data? Absolutely. And can then data enhance? Yes. Is it, the golden buzzer, so to speak? Absolutely not. To me, it's about blending the two in the right way and verifying and validating what the data is showing you with the boots on the ground, and then leveraging the things that the data can't do in terms of the relationships and driving the markets and looking at the ingress, egress, and seeing. We talked earlier about what I look at going into a mall, seeing and experiencing. I mean, I was trained from a brokerage perspective. I was trained that you go into a grocery anchored center and you look at the parking lot, you look at what type of cars are there, right? And that can help you understand the demographics to a certain degree. And then you look at the parking lot itself, and are there oil stains and other things like that that show the cars aren't well maintained, or maybe they are, right? And you go into a supermarket and you look at the assortment of products and you see what kind of meats and spices and, is there an international flair here? Is there not? And so you can start to tell a lot just by doing that and by talking to the manager of the grocery store or the cashier at the grocery store. It's amazing what you can find out. And I don't think that the data can tell you any of that. It can enhance it and it can validate it and it can get you some actionable insights. But at its core, real estate is a physical and touch experience that, if you're going to be successful in it, to me, that's what you've got to start with.
I thought that was awesome. I thought the oil stains and the quality of the car and the spices and everything else, I feel, Gregg, you should be solving cold cases, man. You should not be in retail. You're looking for all the clues and you're finding them.
It's kind of a game. I mean, I remember, my kids used to be like, we're going on, vacation and we're in a market and they're like, uh-oh, here goes dad again. But then you start making it fun. Hey, kids, can you, what kind of cars do you see? And, they start calling out the brands of cars and you're like, and you make a little, almost like a hide and seek game out of it. But it's amazing what it tells you. And I think it's become a lost art because the technology, when you look at, the aerial, you mentioned an aerial earlier, right? You look at, I see so many people in the industry, they look at aerials and they look at like things like demographics and that's all they do. Are those important? Absolutely. But they're not the end all be all. And I think that that's where it's getting lost and people are making decisions without all the right information.
This is such a fun conversation. I can't wait to go to Costco this weekend. We have a big storm coming and now I'll be looking at the cars in the parking lot and what Gen Zers have in their carts versus the millennials. I can't wait. So we covered the past and present, I think, pretty well. I could go on for hours with you, Gregg, but I want to segue to the future. When you look on the horizon for retail, what are you seeing retailers worried about? Manus and I talk a lot on this podcast about macro data, and what the market's doing. So if we are heading into an employment-based recession, what's most at risk? What are you watching?
I'm watching a couple of things. One is I think that there's been a bifurcation of the consumer that has shown its head over the last little bit. And that is, I think you're seeing that the wealthier consumer is propping up the consumer spending right now. And that is overshadowing a lot of the realities of what's happening with the consumer and spending and discretionary spending, et cetera. But that being said, I am seeing it start to trend where even the wealthier consumers are trading down somewhat. And so that's going to be an interesting one to watch because when that happens, there's nobody left to prop up the spending like it has been propped up. So I'm very curious to see how that plays itself out. I think the other one is retail space is at a premium right now, and there's not been a lot of new builds coming into play. And what has been new builds to me, there's been a lot of aspirational new builds where they're trying to capitalize on the experiential and build these big, huge monstrosities. And that's fine. But I don't necessarily think at its core that's what's needed. And so I think the creativity that's having to happen in the retail segment right now of how you look at space and how you create highest and best use from something that maybe becomes retail or restaurant or whatever that no one ever thought could be, right? And how do you make that happen? So I think those two, to me, are ones that I'm really looking at. I am concerned that the consumer is kind of on a little bit of steam in terms of, there's not a lot of substance right now underneath, and that does concern me. But I also know that I've been saying that for like 2 or 3 years now, and it keeps going and it keeps going. So, my hope is that it does. My concern is that as the technology spend, starts to mature out on, the AI and data centers and all that stuff, and as the bifurcation continues, that we are just kind of floating on steam, and there's not a lot of substance underneath, and it starts to break down.
All right, Gregg. So we always like to end these podcasts with a little slice of life. And you basically handed us a gift earlier this week when you wrote about Legos. And the trend that you noted was how kidults, which are adults who are buying the toys and the games and the collectibles that they loved growing up, but they're not buying them for other kids. They're buying them for themselves. So I wonder what your favorite Lego memory is.
So it's actually been recent for me. We just came back from a trip not too long ago to Scandinavia, and it was Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. And when we decided Denmark, that is the corporate headquarters of Lego, but it is a good hour outside of Copenhagen, and it is in a very small, remote area considering, everything. So you have to take a train, then a bus, then like walk, and it's a whole expedition to get to the Lego headquarters. Didn't matter. I have a 29-year-old and a 26-year-old, and we were going to Lego because we were within an hour of the corporate headquarters, and damned if we weren't gonna be there. And so spending the day and watching both them and me, for that matter, inside Lego headquarters with all these builds and everything that was going on, and the excitement and the enjoyment, but also looking at everybody in that, you would think that it would be filled with kids, and it was, but it was filled with just as many adults as there were kids. And it was just interesting, people buying exclusive sets you could only get at corporate headquarters and doing all this stuff. And it also taught me, interestingly enough, it taught me a tough lesson in tariffs, because we bought literally 2 boxes full of Legos and shipped them back to the U.S. only to find a $120 bill waiting for us on tariffs, which we go vastly underestimated. But all that aside, it was a ton of fun, and it just kind of goes with how Legos have been just a big part of the family over the years, and how it's grown. And as you saw from the photo, I'm sure on LinkedIn, how big a part it's become in our house as well.
That's a great story. We were a Lego family ourselves, especially one of my sons. It's great for young kids to follow directions and improve their dexterity. It's just a great thing for young kids to start with. But I have to admit, I'm not a 4-letter word guy. I'm just not me. But maybe 4 of the 5 times I used a 4-letter word, it was because I stepped on a Lego in the morning getting my breakfast, and I was so angry. I think it's a painful memory at times for me.
Well, I will tell you too, it is our Lego city, which my son has named Bricklanta after Atlanta, and Lego is also a very good lesson in real estate, because now we are deciding who owns what and trading for what, and I'm going to have this, and this is my territory. And so it's also become a de facto real estate discussion as people vie and jockey for position in Bricklanta. So you never know where it's going to lead to.
That's great.
That's fantastic. You might be onto something. And it is a rite of passage, Manus, to step on a Lego. There's nothing like that excruciating pain. The thing that strikes me about Lego, Gregg, that I think is really cool is them just evolving in their products. Like, they've come a long way from like the Ninjago days and the Lego cities. Under our tree this year was the Leonardo da Vinci flying machine, Lego botanicals, and so my husband and 2 kids were at the table and they were transformed back to their childhood, which, it is priceless. And sorry about your tariff hit, but you have a great memory.
No, absolutely. And you're right. The memories are priceless, as is, to Manus's point, as is stepping on your first Lego and hoping you never do that again. But it really is a family experience, right? And it resonates through the entire family, which is something you keep with you for a long time. So the brand loyalty and the value of what they bring to the table is definitely there.
Yeah. And back to your point of your post this week about Legos, I think nostalgia is definitely in vogue. And it's clearly a trigger. Last week, our slice of life was about the collectibles that we each have. Manus got me to admit the somewhat embarrassing Smurfs of my childhood. And just when I thought that landed on deaf ears, a loyal listener and a past guest here, David Putro of Morningstar, made me smile this morning when I opened an email. He sent me a picture of his Hilton Hotel in Brussels, which offers a special amenity in the form of a Smurf-inspired room.
Love it.
So thank you for that, David. And I will turn it back over to you, Alyssa, to close us out. Gregg, thank you so much for being here. This was such a pleasure.
Ton of fun, and thank you very, very much for having me.
Thank you to our producers at Bruning Media. Join the Lightbox team every week as they share CRE news and data in context. You can listen on any of your favorite podcast channels and send your comments or questions to podcast@lightboxre.com. As always, thank you for listening and have a great week.
Let's go.